The future of the global economy is no longer a distant idea discussed only by economists and policymakers. It is a process already in motion, supported by data, demographics, and long-term trends that are impossible to ignore. According to the World Bank, global economic growth averaged above 4% during the second half of the 20th century. In contrast, over the last decade, average global growth has struggled to remain above 3%, even before major shocks like the COVID-19 pandemic and geopolitical conflicts. This slowdown is not accidental. It is the result of structural changes that are reshaping how economies function at their core. For decades, the global economic system relied on a simple and powerful formula. A growing population meant a growing workforce. A growing workforce meant higher production, rising consumption, and expanding tax revenues. This model worked exceptionally well after World War II. United Nations data shows that the global population grew from about 2.5 billion in 1950 to more than 8 billion today. This population boom created what economists call a demographic dividend, where a large working-age population supports economic expansion while a relatively small elderly population depends on it. Countries like the United States, Germany, Japan, and later China built their economic success on this foundation. However, demographic data now shows that this engine of growth is slowing and, in many regions, reversing. According to the United Nations Population Division, more than 2/3 of the world ES population now lives in countries where fertility rates are below the replacement level of 2.1 children per woman. Japan's fertility rate has remained around 1.3 for decades. Italy and Spain are close to 1.2. China's fertility rate has fallen below 1.3, despite the end of the one-child policy. These numbers are not just statistics. They directly determine how many workers an economy will have in the future. Fewer births today mean fewer workers, consumers, and taxpayers tomorrow. Japan provides the clearest early example of what an aging economy looks like. Japan's population peaked in 2008 and has been declining ever since. According to Japan's Ministry of Internal Affairs, nearly 30% of the population is now over the age of 65. As a result, Japan has experienced decades of low economic growth, weak domestic demand, and rising public debt. Government debt in Japan exceeds 250% of GDP, the highest among developed nations. Despite advanced technology and high productivity, Japan struggles to generate strong growth because its workforce continues to shrink. This is not a temporary cycle. It is a structural reality driven by demographics. Europe is moving in the same direction. Eurostat data shows that the median age in the European Union has risen from 38 years in 2001 to over 44 years today. Germany, the economic engine of Europe, is expected to lose millions of working-age people by 2035 unless immigration increases significantly. At the same time, pension and healthcare spending is rising sharply. According to the OECD, age-related public spending in many European countries will increase by 3 to 5% of GDP over the next 3 decades. This places enormous pressure on public finances, especially in a low-growth environment. China's situation is even more significant because of its size and role in the global economy. For decades, China's rapid growth was fueled by a massive labor force and high investment. But data from China ES National Bureau of Statistics confirms that China ES working-age population peaked around 2014 and has been declining since. In 2022, China officially reported a population decline for the first time in over 60 years. This shift threatens the economic model that made China the world's manufacturing hub. Fewer young workers mean rising labor costs, slower industrial expansion, and weaker long-term growth. Given China's central role in global supply chains, this demographic shift has global consequences. At the same time as populations age, debt levels across the world have surged. According to the International Monetary Fund, total global debt now exceeds 300% of global GDP. Government debt alone has risen sharply since the 2008 financial crisis and again after the pandemic. In aging societies, this debt becomes harder to manage. As the number of retirees increases, governments must spend more on pensions and healthcare, while the number of workers paying taxes declines. This imbalance reduces fiscal flexibility and increases the risk of future crises. Historical evidence shows that high debt combined with low growth often leads to long periods of stagnation or painful economic adjustments. Many policymakers place their hopes in technology as a solution. Automation, artificial intelligence, and robotics are expected to boost productivity and offset labor shortages. Research by the OECD and McKinsey confirms that technology can raise output per worker. However, these same studies also warn that automation may displace a significant share of existing jobs. Unlike previous technological shifts, AI threatens not only manual labor, but also white-collar and professional roles. This raises a fundamental question for future economies. If fewer people work, or if work becomes more unstable, how will income be distributed and how will governments fund public systems in aging societies? Globalization, another pillar of past growth, is also changing shape. World Trade Organization data shows that global trade growth has slowed significantly since the 2010s. Trade tensions, supply chain disruptions, and geopolitical conflicts have pushed countries to prioritize security and resilience over efficiency. The pandemic and the war in Ukraine demonstrated how quickly global supply networks can break down. As countries reshore production and diversify supply chains, costs rise and growth slows further. This does not mean globalization will disappear, but it will look very different from the system that powered growth for the last 3 decades. Energy adds another layer of complexity. Modern economic growth was built on cheap and abundant fossil fuels. According to the International Energy Agency, the global transition toward renewable energy will require trillions of dollars in investment over the coming decades. While this transition is essential, it also introduces short to medium-term economic challenges, including energy price volatility and inflationary pressure. Energy shocks have historically been linked to recessions, and the transition period is likely to produce similar stresses. Taken together, these trends point toward a future global economy defined by slower growth, aging populations, high debt, technological disruption, and geopolitical fragmentation. Economists often describe this environment as secular stagnation, a condition where economies struggle to generate strong growth despite low interest rates and technological progress. This is not a sudden collapse, but a gradual weakening of economic momentum that affects living standards, social stability, and political trust. Yet this is only the starting point of the story, because while the data clearly shows what is changing, it does not yet explain how different countries will respond, who will adapt successfully, and who will struggle the most. The future of the global economy will not be shaped by demographics alone, but by policy choices, institutional strength, and the ability of societies to adjust to realities they can no longer avoid. What happens next depends on how governments confront these pressures, and whether the economic systems built for the past can be redesigned for a very different future. To understand where the global economy is heading, it is essential to look beyond surface-level indicators like GDP growth and stock market performance. The deeper drivers of future economic outcomes lie in productivity, labor participation, and the structure of work itself. For decades, rising productivity allowed economies to grow even when population growth slowed. However, data from multiple institutions now shows that productivity growth has been weakening across much of the world. According to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, average labor productivity growth in advanced economies fell from around 2% per year in the late 20th century to less than 1% in the last decade. This decline is one of the most important and least discussed threats to future prosperity. Productivity matters because it determines how much output an economy can generate from its available labor and capital. When productivity rises, wages can increase without triggering inflation, living standards improve, and governments collect more tax revenue without raising rates. When productivity stagnates, economies face difficult trade-offs. Wages stagnate, inequality rises, and political tensions increase. The reasons for the current productivity slowdown are complex. Some economists argue that recent technological innovations are less transformative than past breakthroughs like electricity or the internal combustion engine. Others point to aging workforces, declining business investment, and reduced competition in many industries. Regardless of the cause, the result is the same. Without a reversal in productivity trends, future economic growth will remain weak. Labor markets are another critical piece of the future economy. In many countries, labor shortages are emerging even as growth slows. This may seem contradictory, but it reflects deep structural change. According to the International Labour Organization, labor force participation rates are declining in many aging societies as older workers retire faster than younger workers enter the workforce. Japan again provides an early example. Despite low unemployment, Japan struggles to fill jobs in healthcare, construction, and manufacturing. Europe faces similar challenges. In Germany, surveys by business associations consistently report shortages of skilled workers as one of the biggest constraints on growth. At the same time, not all workers benefit equally from labor market tightness. While some sectors experience shortages, others face job insecurity due to automation and restructuring. Research by the World Economic Forum estimates that by the mid-2030s, automation and artificial intelligence could displace tens of millions of jobs globally, even as new roles are created. The problem is not only job loss, but job mismatch. Workers displaced from traditional roles may not have the skills required for emerging sectors. This creates friction in the labor market, where vacancies and unemployment can exist simultaneously. Managing this transition will be one of the defining challenges of future economic policy. Income distribution is closely linked to these labor market dynamics. Over the past 4 decades, income and wealth inequality have increased in many advanced economies. Data from the World Inequality Database shows that the top 10% of income earners have captured a growing share of national income, while wages for middle and lower income workers have stagnated. This trend weakens long-term growth by reducing consumer demand and increasing social tension. In aging societies, inequality also affects intergenerational fairness. Younger generations face higher housing costs, student debt, and uncertain job prospects, while older generations often benefit from accumulated assets and protected pensions. If these imbalances continue, political pressure for redistribution and reform is likely to intensify. Housing is a clear example of how structural economic forces shape everyday life. In many major cities across the world, housing affordability has deteriorated sharply. According to the International Monetary Fund, real house prices have increased faster than incomes in most advanced economies over the past 2 decades. Low interest rates, limited supply, and rising investment demand have pushed prices beyond the reach of many young households. High housing costs reduce labor mobility, delay family formation, and contribute to falling birth rates, creating a feedback loop that worsens demographic decline. Housing markets therefore play a crucial role in shaping the future workforce and long-term economic stability. Public finances will be under increasing strain as these trends converge. Aging populations mean higher spending on pensions, healthcare, and long-term care. According to projections by the European Commission, age-related public spending could rise by several percentage points of GDP in many EU countries by 2050. In the United States, the Congressional Budget Office estimates that spending on Social Security and Medicare will grow significantly faster than GDP over the coming decades. Without reform, these programs will either require higher taxes, increased borrowing, or reduced benefits. Each option carries economic and political costs. High taxes can discourage investment and work. Excessive borrowing raises the risk of financial instability. Benefit cuts can provoke social unrest and political backlash. Monetary policy, once seen as a reliable tool to stabilize the economy, also faces limits in the future landscape. For much of the post-2008 period, central banks relied on low interest rates and asset purchases to support growth. While these policies prevented deeper recessions, they also contributed to rising asset prices and inequality. As inflation returned in the early 2020s, central banks were forced to raise rates, exposing the vulnerability of highly indebted governments, households, and firms. In a future characterized by high debt and low growth, central banks will have less room to respond to shocks. This reduces the overall resilience of the economic system. Global trade and investment patterns are also evolving in ways that will shape future outcomes. According to United Nations Conference on Trade and Development data, global foreign direct investment flows have become more volatile and increasingly concentrated among a smaller number of countries. Strategic considerations now play a larger role in investment decisions, particularly in sectors such as semiconductors, energy, and critical minerals. Governments are using industrial policy more actively to secure supply chains and promote domestic production. While this can support strategic goals, it may also reduce efficiency and increase costs. The long-term impact on productivity and growth remains uncertain. Developing economies face a different but equally complex set of challenges. Many emerging markets benefited from globalization and rapid urbanization over the past decades. However, they now face higher borrowing costs, climate risks, and slowing global demand. According to the World Bank, many low- and middle-income countries entered the 2020s with limited fiscal space and rising debt. Climate change adds further pressure by increasing the frequency of extreme weather events, damaging infrastructure, and reducing agricultural productivity. These factors threaten development progress and increase the risk of economic divergence between regions. Technology remains both a risk and an opportunity. While automation threatens existing jobs, digitalization also offers the potential to improve efficiency, expand access to services, and create new industries. The key question is whether societies can manage this transition effectively. Education systems, labor market institutions, and social safety nets will play a decisive role. Countries that invest in skills, support worker mobility, and encourage innovation may be able to harness technology for inclusive growth. Those that fail to adapt risk deeper inequality and social fragmentation. Taken together, these forces suggest that the future global economy will be shaped less by rapid expansion and more by adaptation and resilience. Growth may be slower, but the quality of growth will matter more than ever. How income is distributed, how work is organized, how public resources are allocated, and how societies balance efficiency with fairness. These choices will determine not only economic performance, but also political stability and social cohesion. What remains unclear is which models will succeed in this new environment. Will countries prioritize flexibility or protection? Will they rely on markets or state intervention? And can international cooperation survive in a world of increasing competition and mistrust? The answers to these questions are already emerging in policy experiments and political debates around the world, and examining them closely reveals important clues about the economic systems that may define the decades ahead. One of the most powerful forces shaping the future global economy is demographics. Population trends act slowly, but once set in motion, they are extremely difficult to reverse. According to data from the United Nations Population Division, more than 2/3 of the world's population now lives in countries where fertility rates are below the replacement level of 2.1 births per woman. This means that without immigration, populations in these countries will eventually shrink. Aging societies are no longer limited to Japan or Europe. China, South Korea, Russia, and even parts of Latin America are now experiencing rapid demographic transition. Japan provides the clearest long-term case study of what an aging economy looks like. Japan's median age has risen to over 48 years, one of the highest in the world. Its working-age population has been shrinking since the mid-1990s. According to Japan's Ministry of Internal Affairs, The country has lost millions of workers over the past 3 decades. This demographic decline has directly affected economic growth. Japan's GDP growth has remained low despite technological sophistication and high capital intensity. Government debt has risen to over 250% of GDP, largely due to social spending and repeated fiscal stimulus to support demand. Japan shows that even advanced, stable societies struggle to maintain growth when demographics turn negative. China is now entering a similar phase, but under very different conditions. For decades, China relied on a massive working-age population to drive industrial expansion and exports. However, according to China's National Bureau of Statistics, the country's population began to decline in the early 2020s. Fertility rates have fallen far below replacement level, despite the removal of the one-child policy. At the same time, China's workforce is aging rapidly. This shift comes as China attempts to move from investment-led growth to a consumption and innovation-driven model. Fewer workers mean higher labor costs, lower potential growth, and increased pressure on pension and healthcare systems. Given China's size, its demographic slowdown will have global consequences, affecting supply chains, commodity demand, and international trade patterns. Europe faces a demographic challenge of similar magnitude. According to Eurostat, the old-age dependency ratio in the European Union is projected to rise sharply over the coming decades. This means fewer workers supporting more retirees. Countries such as Italy, Spain, and Germany already struggle with low fertility and aging populations. Immigration has helped slow the decline, but political resistance limits its potential. As the labor force shrinks, governments face lower tax revenues and higher social spending, tightening fiscal constraints. Without productivity gains or structural reform, Europe risks prolonged economic stagnation. Demographics also influence inflation, interest rates, and savings behavior. Aging societies tend to save more and spend less, reducing aggregate demand. This dynamic contributed to the low inflation and low interest rate environment that characterized much of the early 21st century. According to research by the International Monetary Fund, demographic aging has been a significant factor behind declining real interest rates globally. However, as aging increases fiscal pressure and labor shortages push up wages in certain sectors, inflation dynamics may become more volatile. The interaction between aging, debt, and inflation will shape future monetary policy choices. Government debt is another critical constraint on the future economy. According to IMF data, global public debt has reached record levels, exceeding 90% of global GDP. Many advanced economies carry debt burdens far higher than historical norms. The United States, Japan, and several European countries now operate with debt-to-GDP ratios that would have been considered unsustainable in earlier decades. While low interest rates previously made high debt manageable, rising rates increase servicing costs. This limits governments' ability to respond to future crises with fiscal stimulus. High debt also raises the risk of political conflict over taxes and spending priorities. Emerging markets face even sharper constraints. Many borrowed heavily in foreign currencies during periods of low global interest rates. As rates rise, debt servicing becomes more expensive. According to the World Bank, several low-income countries are already in or near debt distress. This reduces investment in education, healthcare, and infrastructure, undermining long-term growth potential. Debt crises in emerging markets can spill over into the global economy through financial markets, trade, and migration pressures. Another major structural force is climate change. Economic models increasingly recognize climate risk as a macroeconomic issue, not just an environmental one. According to reports by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, rising temperatures and extreme weather events reduce agricultural productivity, damage infrastructure, and increase health costs. The World Bank estimates that climate change could push tens of millions of people into poverty by mid-century if unmitigated. For economies dependent on agriculture, tourism, or coastal infrastructure, climate shocks can permanently reduce output. At the same time, The transition to a low-carbon economy requires massive investment, reshaping energy markets, labor demand, and industrial structure. Energy systems themselves are undergoing a fundamental transformation. The shift away from fossil fuels toward renewable energy changes cost structures and geopolitical relationships. According to the International Energy Agency, global investment in clean energy is rising rapidly but unevenly across regions. Countries that secure access to critical minerals and develop domestic energy capacity may gain strategic advantages. Others risk higher costs and supply disruptions. Energy transitions can support growth and innovation, but poorly managed transitions can create inflationary pressure and social backlash, as seen during recent energy price shocks. Geopolitics now plays a larger role in economic outcomes than it did during the height of globalization. Trade tensions, sanctions, and strategic rivalry influence investment decisions and supply chains. According to data from the World Trade Organization, global trade growth has slowed relative to GDP since the late 2000s. Companies increasingly prioritize resilience over efficiency, diversifying suppliers, and reshoring production. While this reduces vulnerability to shocks, it also raises costs and lowers productivity. The long-term balance between security and efficiency remains uncertain. Taken together, demographics, debt, climate change, energy transitions, and geopolitics form a web of constraints that will define the future economic landscape. These forces interact with each other, amplifying risks and limiting policy options. Governments face a narrower path than in the past. Choices that once seemed manageable now carry higher trade-offs. Ignoring these structural realities does not make them disappear. It only increases the cost of adjustment later. The critical question is how different economic systems will respond to these pressures. Some may attempt to delay adjustment through borrowing and short-term stimulus. Others may pursue reform, investment, and long-term planning. The outcomes of these choices will not only determine growth rates, but also shape social stability and global power balances. And as these pressures intensify, the role of technology and innovation becomes even more central, raising a new set of questions about productivity, inequality, and the nature of work in the decades ahead. Technology and innovation are often presented as the ultimate solution to the economic challenges of the future. Artificial intelligence, automation, robotics, and digital platforms promise higher productivity, lower costs, and entirely new industries. However, history shows that technological progress does not automatically translate into broad-based economic prosperity. The way technology is adopted, regulated, and distributed across society determines whether it becomes a force for inclusive growth or a driver of deeper inequality. Artificial intelligence is at the center of this transformation. According to studies by McKinsey Global Institute, AI could contribute trillions of dollars to global GDP over the coming decades by improving efficiency and enabling new products and services. Tasks that once required human judgment can now be performed by algorithms at scale. From logistics optimization to medical diagnostics, AI is already reshaping how economies function. However, these gains are unevenly distributed. Firms with access to capital, data, and skilled labor benefit the most, while smaller firms and less skilled workers risk falling behind. This concentration effect raises concerns about market power and long-term competition. Automation directly affects labor markets, but not in a simple way. While some jobs disappear, others change or are newly created. According to the OECD, occupations involving routine and predictable tasks are most vulnerable to automation. Manufacturing, clerical work, and certain service jobs face the highest risk. At the same time, demand is rising for skills related to data analysis, software development, healthcare, and personal services. The challenge lies in the speed of transition. Workers displaced by automation may not be able to retrain quickly enough, leading to periods of unemployment or underemployment. This adjustment cost can weaken consumer demand and increase social tension. Education systems play a crucial role in determining whether societies can adapt to technological change. Yet many education models were designed for industrial-era economies. According to UNESCO, large gaps remain in access to quality education and lifelong learning opportunities, especially in developing countries. Even in advanced economies, curricula often lag behind labor market needs. Without substantial reform, skill mismatches will persist, limiting the productivity gains from new technologies. Investment in human capital is therefore not optional. It is a central requirement for future economic stability. Digital platforms have transformed markets by reducing transaction costs and expanding access to information. However, they have also changed the nature of competition. A small number of global platforms now dominate sectors such as e-commerce, digital advertising, and social media. According to competition authorities in the European Union and the United States, network effects and data advantages allow these firms to entrench their positions. This reduces competitive pressure and may slow innovation over time. It also shifts income toward capital owners and highly skilled workers, reinforcing inequality. The regulation of digital markets will significantly influence future economic outcomes. Financial systems are also being reshaped by technology. Digital payments, cryptocurrencies, and decentralized finance challenge traditional banking models. According to the Bank for International Settlements, central banks around the world are exploring digital currencies to improve payment efficiency and maintain monetary control. While financial innovation can increase inclusion and reduce costs, it also introduces new risks. Cybersecurity threats, market volatility, and regulatory gaps can undermine trust. Financial instability in a highly digitalized system can spread rapidly, amplifying shocks across borders. Innovation is closely linked to investment, and here, the future presents mixed signals. While global spending on research and development has increased, it is concentrated in a small number of countries and firms. According to World Intellectual Property Organization data, the United States, China, and a few other economies account for the majority of global R&D investment. Many developing countries struggle to finance innovation, limiting their ability to move up the value chain. This divergence risks creating a two-speed global economy where technological leaders pull further ahead while others remain dependent on low-value activities. Public policy plays a decisive role in shaping technological outcomes. Governments influence innovation through education, infrastructure, regulation, and public investment. Successful historical examples, such as the development of the Internet and modern semiconductor industries, show that state involvement can complement market forces. However, poorly designed intervention can waste resources and distort incentives. The challenge for policymakers is to support innovation without suppressing competition or locking in inefficient technologies. This balance will be harder to achieve in a world of fiscal constraints and political polarization. The relationship between technology and inequality is one of the most sensitive issues of the future economy. According to data from the World Inequality Database, returns to capital have grown faster than wages in many countries. Technology accelerates this trend by increasing the productivity of capital relative to labor. Without countervailing policies such as progressive taxation, social protection, and access to education, inequality may continue to rise. High inequality weakens social cohesion and undermines democratic institutions, creating long-term economic risk. Technology also reshapes global competition. Countries that lead in AI, biotechnology, and advanced manufacturing gain strategic and economic advantages. This has turned innovation into a geopolitical issue. Governments increasingly view technology as a matter of national security. Export controls, investment screening, and industrial policy are becoming common tools. According to the International Monetary Fund, this fragmentation of technology markets could reduce global productivity growth by limiting knowledge spillovers and increasing duplication of effort. The long-term cost of technological rivalry may be lower global growth. Despite these risks, technology remains one of the few forces capable of offsetting demographic decline and productivity slowdown. Automation can help compensate for labor shortages in aging societies. Digital services can expand access to healthcare and education. Clean technologies can reduce the economic damage of climate change. The key question is governance. Who controls technology? Who benefits from it? And how societies manage the transition it creates? As technology accelerates, the pressure on economic institutions intensifies. Labor laws, tax systems, and social safety nets were designed for a different era. Updating them to reflect new forms of work and income is essential. Failure to adapt will increase insecurity and resistance to change. Success could unlock a new phase of sustainable growth. The direction the global economy takes will therefore depend not only on technological capability, but on collective choices. Whether technology becomes a stabilizing force or a source of disruption depends on decisions being made now. And as these decisions unfold, they interact with deeper political and institutional forces that shape trust, legitimacy, and cooperation within and between nations, setting the stage for the economic models that may dominate the future. Economic systems do not operate in isolation from politics and institutions. In fact, institutions often determine how economic pressures are absorbed or amplified. As the global economy faces slower growth, aging populations, and technological disruption, political systems are coming under increasing strain. According to research by the World Bank, institutional quality strongly correlates with long-term economic performance. Countries with stable governance, effective public administration, and rule of law tend to adapt better to structural change than those with weak institutions. One of the most significant political economic trends of recent decades is the rise of populism. Slower growth and rising inequality have eroded trust in traditional political elites. Data from multiple electoral studies in Europe and the United States shows that support for populist movements increases during periods of economic insecurity. Populism often promises quick solutions to complex problems, such as protectionism, price controls, or debt-funded spending. While these policies may provide short-term relief, they often undermine long-term growth by reducing investment, distorting markets, and weakening institutions. The challenge for the future economy is managing social frustration without sacrificing economic stability. Fiscal policy will play a central role in this balancing act. Governments face growing demands for social spending, infrastructure investment, and climate adaptation. At the same time, high debt levels limit fiscal flexibility. According to the International Monetary Fund, many advanced economies will need to stabilize or reduce debt-to-GDP ratios over the coming decades to avoid rising risk premiums. This creates difficult choices. Cutting spending risks social unrest. Raising taxes can face political resistance and may affect growth. Delaying adjustment increases the risk of crisis. The effectiveness of fiscal policy will depend on credibility, targeting, and long-term planning. Tax systems themselves are under pressure from globalization and digitalization. Multinational firms can shift profits across borders, reducing national tax bases. According to the OECD, aggressive tax planning costs governments hundreds of billions of dollars annually in lost revenue. International efforts to establish minimum corporate tax rates aim to address this problem, but implementation remains uneven. Without effective coordination, tax competition may intensify, limiting governments' ability to fund public goods and social protection. Social safety nets are another critical institutional pillar. As labor markets become more volatile, income security becomes more important. Unemployment insurance, healthcare access, and pension systems reduce the economic cost of adjustment. According to the International Labour Organization, countries with stronger social protection systems tend to experience smoother labor market transitions during economic shocks. However, maintaining these systems in aging societies is expensive. Reforming social protection without undermining public trust is one of the most politically sensitive challenges of the future economy. Migration policy also shapes economic outcomes. Migration can alleviate labor shortages, support public finances, and increase diversity and innovation. According to the United Nations, migrants contribute positively to economic growth in many host countries. However, migration is politically contentious. Poor integration and uneven distribution of benefits can fuel social tension. Effective migration policy requires investment in education, housing, and labor market access. When managed well, migration can support economic resilience. When mismanaged, it can deepen polarization and undermine institutional legitimacy. Global governance structures are also being tested. Institutions created after World War II, such as the International Monetary Fund, World Bank, and World Trade Organization, were designed for a different economic landscape. Emerging economies now account for a larger share of global output, yet governance structures have not fully adapted. According to multiple policy analyses, this mismatch reduces trust in international institutions and weakens cooperation. At a time when global challenges like climate change, pandemics, and financial instability require collective action, weakened global governance increases systemic risk. Geopolitical rivalry further complicates cooperation. Strategic competition between major powers influences trade, technology, and finance. Sanctions, export controls, and investment restrictions are increasingly used as economic tools. According to IMF research, economic fragmentation could significantly reduce global output over the long term. While some degree of strategic autonomy may be necessary, excessive fragmentation raises costs and reduces efficiency. The future global economy will need to balance national security concerns with the benefits of openness. Public trust is a critical but often overlooked economic variable. Trust influences investment decisions, compliance with regulations, and social cohesion. According to surveys by the Edelman Trust Barometer and similar studies, trust in governments and institutions has declined in many countries. Low trust increases transaction costs and reduces policy effectiveness. Rebuilding trust requires transparency, accountability, and consistent policy frameworks. Without trust, even well-designed economic reforms can fail. The interaction between politics, institutions, and the economy suggests that technical solutions alone are insufficient. Economic reform must be politically sustainable. Policies that ignore distributional effects risk backlash and reversal. At the same time, avoiding reform altogether increases long-term risk. Successful societies will be those that can build consensus around gradual, credible change, even in a polarized environment. As institutional pressures mount, the question is not whether economic systems will change, but how. Some countries may move towards stronger state involvement to manage risk and inequality. Others may emphasize market flexibility and individual responsibility. The outcomes of these choices will shape growth, stability, and social cohesion. And as these institutional experiments unfold, they intersect with a final critical question. What kind of economic model can remain both efficient and legitimate in a world defined by uncertainty, slower growth, and rising complexity? As the global economy moves into an era of slower growth and higher uncertainty, the concept of economic resilience becomes more important than rapid expansion. Resilience refers to the ability of economies to absorb shocks, adapt to change, and continue functioning without collapsing into prolonged crises. According to analysis by the International Monetary Fund, countries with diversified economies, strong institutions, and flexible labor markets recover faster from economic disruptions than those reliant on narrow growth models. This shift in focus from growth speed to stability marks a fundamental change in economic thinking. Supply chains illustrate this transformation clearly. For decades, efficiency and cost minimization dominated global production strategies. Firms concentrated manufacturing in a small number of locations to benefit from economies of scale. However, recent shocks, including pandemics, geopolitical tensions, and energy crises, expose the fragility of these systems. Data from the World Trade Organization shows an increase in trade policy interventions and reshoring initiatives since the early 2020s. Companies now prioritize redundancy and reliability, even at higher cost. While this reduces vulnerability to shocks, it also raises prices and lowers overall productivity growth, creating a trade-off between resilience and efficiency. Financial resilience is another major concern. Global financial markets are deeply interconnected, allowing capital to flow rapidly across borders. This integration supports investment, but also spreads risk. According to the Bank for International Settlements, global private and public debt has reached levels that amplify financial instability. Highly leveraged systems are sensitive to interest rate changes and confidence shocks. Banking crises, once seen as isolated events, can now propagate globally within days. Strengthening financial regulation, capital buffers, and macroprudential oversight is therefore essential to future stability. Households face increasing economic volatility as well. Labor income has become less predictable due to contract work, automation, and restructuring. According to OECD studies, income volatility has increased for many workers over the past 2 decades, even when average incomes rise. This uncertainty affects consumption behavior, savings rates, and mental well-being. Economies with limited social protection experience sharper downturns during crises as households reduce spending more aggressively. Building household resilience through insurance, savings mechanisms, and stable access to essential services is a core component of long-term economic health. Urbanization and regional inequality also influence resilience. Economic activity is increasingly concentrated in major cities, where productivity and innovation tend to be higher. However, this concentration leaves peripheral regions vulnerable to decline. Data from national statistical agencies in multiple countries shows widening gaps between urban and rural incomes. Regions left behind often experience population loss, weaker public services, and political dissatisfaction. Balanced regional development policies can reduce these disparities, but they require sustained investment and coordination. Ignoring regional inequality increases social fragmentation and undermines national cohesion. Climate-related shocks represent a growing threat to economic stability. Extreme weather events disrupt production, destroy infrastructure, and strain public finances. According to the World Meteorological Organization, the frequency and intensity of climate-related disasters has increased significantly over recent decades. Insurance losses and reconstruction costs place pressure on both private and public balance sheets. Economies that fail to invest in adaptation face rising long-term costs. Climate resilience is therefore not only an environmental issue, but a macroeconomic necessity. Healthcare systems are another pillar of resilience, particularly in aging societies. The economic impact of health crises extends beyond medical costs to labor supply and productivity. According to the World Health Organization, countries with stronger primary healthcare systems experience lower economic disruption during health emergencies. Investment in healthcare infrastructure, workforce capacity, and preventive care reduces vulnerability to future shocks. However, healthcare spending competes with other fiscal priorities, intensifying budgetary pressure. Innovation policy also shapes resilience. Economies that encourage experimentation and entrepreneurship can adapt more quickly to change. According to research by the OECD, dynamic business environments with lower barriers to entry and exit tend to reallocate resources more efficiently. This creative destruction supports long-term productivity, but can cause short-term disruption. Managing this tension requires policies that support displaced workers while allowing inefficient firms to exit. Protecting existing structures at all costs may preserve jobs temporarily but weakens adaptability over time. International cooperation remains a critical yet fragile component of resilience. Global challenges such as financial crises, climate change, and pandemics cannot be managed by individual countries alone. According to IMF and World Bank assessments, coordinated policy responses reduce the severity of global downturns. However, trust between nations has eroded, making cooperation harder to achieve. Fragmented responses increase uncertainty and reduce effectiveness, raising the risk of prolonged instability. As these pressures accumulate, economic policymaking becomes increasingly complex. Policymakers must navigate trade-offs between growth and stability, efficiency and equity, national autonomy and global integration. Simple solutions no longer exist. Decisions taken today shape not only economic outcomes, but also public confidence in institutions and the willingness of societies to accept change. What remains unresolved is whether current economic models are capable of evolving fast enough to meet these challenges. Can systems built for an era of expansion adapt to an age of constraints? Can resilience be strengthened without sacrificing innovation and openness? And most importantly, what kind of long-term economic framework can balance stability, fairness, and opportunity in a world where uncertainty is becoming the norm rather than the exception? The future of the global economy will not be defined by a single event or a single decision. It will be shaped by millions of interconnected choices made by governments, businesses, and individuals over many years. What is becoming clear, however, is that the era of easy growth is over. The assumptions that powered the global economy in the late 20th and early 21st centuries are no longer reliable. Demographic decline, rising debt, climate risk, technological disruption, and geopolitical fragmentation have fundamentally altered the landscape. Economic history shows that periods of transition are often misunderstood while they are happening. During the Industrial Revolution, societies struggled with inequality, urban poverty, and political unrest before new institutions emerged. The post-World War II economic order was built only after massive disruption and reform. According to economic historians, major structural shifts usually involve long phases of instability, followed by gradual adaptation. The current moment fits this pattern. The global economy is not collapsing, but it is transforming in ways that challenge existing models and expectations. Growth in the future is likely to be slower, but slower growth does not automatically mean lower living standards. The quality of growth will matter more than its speed. Productivity improvements driven by technology can still raise incomes, but only if benefits are widely shared. Investments in education, healthcare, and infrastructure can strengthen long-term potential, even under fiscal constraints. According to the World Bank, countries that prioritize human capital and institutional quality tend to perform better over long horizons, regardless of short-term cycles. The role of the state is also evolving. Governments are being asked to do more with limited resources. They must manage aging populations, support technological transition, and respond to climate risk while maintaining financial stability. This requires better governance, not simply bigger government. Evidence from multiple countries shows that effective public administration and policy credibility are more important than spending levels alone. Poorly targeted intervention can worsen outcomes, while well-designed policies can crowd in private investment and innovation. Markets will remain central to economic organization, but they cannot operate effectively without trust and rules. Competition, transparency, and accountability are essential to ensure that innovation benefits society as a whole. As digital platforms and large firms gain influence, regulatory frameworks must adapt to prevent excessive concentration of power. According to competition authorities and economic research, healthy markets require continuous oversight, especially during periods of rapid technological change. At the global level, cooperation faces serious obstacles, yet the cost of failure is high. Climate change, financial instability, and health crises do not respect borders. Fragmentation may offer short-term political advantages, but long-term economic evidence suggests that coordination reduces risk and improves outcomes. Rebuilding trust between nations will be difficult, but ignoring shared challenges will only increase future costs. Perhaps the most important factor shaping the future economy is social legitimacy. Economic systems endure not only because they are efficient, but because people believe they are fair. Rising inequality, housing insecurity, and job uncertainty undermine this belief. Without legitimacy, even technically sound policies face resistance. According to political economy research, societies that manage distributional conflict through inclusive institutions are more stable and adaptable over time. The future global economy will therefore be defined by trade-offs rather than simple solutions. Stability versus speed, efficiency versus resilience, national control versus global cooperation. There is no perfect model that eliminates risk. What matters is the ability to learn, adjust, and respond before pressures turn into crises. The decisions being made today about technology, demographics, climate, and institutions will shape economic outcomes for decades. These choices will determine whether future generations inherit systems that offer opportunity and security, or systems marked by fragmentation and instability. The question that remains is not whether change is coming, but whether societies are prepared to guide that change deliberately rather than react to it under pressure. What do you think will matter more in the economy of tomorrow? Faster growth at any cost, or a more resilient system that grows slower but lasts longer? Share your thoughts in the comments, because this conversation does not end here. And if you want to keep exploring how the global economy is evolving and what it means for the future, staying connected to this channel will help you understand what comes next.